But with this president, this is what the news is like now. And on days like today, with news cycles like this, I will admit to finding it a little, I don't know if it's unnerving, it's at least unsettling, that those kinds of stories that I just described there from today's news cycle, those are unspooling in today's news alongside this continually devolving scandal in Washington. This today was President Trump's Labor Secretary, Alex Acosta, giving a lengthy press conference in which he addressed his role as a U.S. attorney in Florida in a still murky deal a dozen years ago in which he and his office signed a federal non-prosecution agreement with Jeffrey Epstein, a wealthy and well-connected convicted sexual predator who did serve a little bit of time with generous provisions for work release on state prostitution charges in Florida. Alex Acosta is feeling the need to explain his actions from back in the day related to the Epstein case, because Epstein is now facing decades in prison, even though Alex Acosta wouldn't bring charges against Epstein when he was the U.S. attorney in Florida and when the FBI amassed enough evidence for a 50-plus page indictment against Epstein in Florida when Acosta was the U.S. attorney there. Even though Acosta wouldn't bring federal charges against him, somebody else finally did bring considerable federal charges against Epstein, in this case for sex trafficking. Jeffrey Epstein has pled not guilty. He is facing 45 years in prison if he is convicted and sentenced to the maximum term. Well, today in Washington, the press conference by Labor Secretary Alex Acosta was designed, it seemed, to signal that he is not planning on resigning over this scandal. Labor Secretary also took questions. This was clearly him showing that he's willing to face criticism on this matter, willing to face his critics. But Alex Acosta's defense today has already started to boomerang on him. And this I did not expect. In a bunch of different ways, what Secretary Acosta did today, in particular, the information that he released to the press today, seemed to have made things worse for him in terms of his efforts to justify his previous actions and to justify why he shouldn't be apologizing now, at least if not resigning, over his role in this scandal now that Jeffrey Epstein is facing federal charges, since Acosta couldn't bring himself to bring similar charges when he had Epstein in his clutches years ago. I mean, first of all, there's the fact that a federal judge has now ruled that Alex Acosta's office broke the law when they made this non-prosecution deal with Jeffrey Epstein without notifying Epstein's victims that they were doing so. Acosta is going to face some sort of sanction in federal court for having broken the law in that way, right? The judge has already said Acosta's office, under his leadership, broke the law by not telling the victims about the deal before they did it. We're waiting to find out what his sanction is going to be from the court. That itself makes it remarkable that he is still a cabinet official and he hasn't resigned or been fired. But even today, while mounting this defense and knowing that that decision from the court is pending in terms of his fate, Acosta still has no answer on that issue. And he has no apologies for Epstein's victims either, even though he was explicitly asked today if he saw any need that he should apologize to them. Remember, he did this deal with Epstein without telling Epstein's victims that he was doing it, which was against the law. And in fact, to make it all worse today, Acosta released a declaration from his lead prosecutor who worked on the case, which included some damning admissions that don't help Acosta on this at all. For example, the materials that Alex Acosta handed out to the press today in his big defensive press conference included this letter in which his lead prosecutor, working under his leadership in his office, spelled out explicitly that Alex Acosta's office stopped its efforts to notify Epstein's victims about this non-prosecution deal, specifically because Epstein told them to. Because Epstein's lawyers demanded that they stop telling the victims. Acosta's office spells it out explicitly in this letter to Epstein's lawyers why they stopped victim notification about Epstein's deal. Quote, 3 victims were notified shortly after the signing of the non-prosecution agreement, notified of the general terms of that agreement. You, meaning you, Epstein's lawyers, raised objections to any victim notification, and no further notifications were done. So Acosta's office has already been found by a judge to have broken the law by not telling the victims about the deal they were giving to Epstein. Acosta just released information today showing us all that his office admitted in writing that the reason they didn't notify more victims is because Jeffrey Epstein told them not to. That's why they stopped. I mean, so that's a problem for Labor Secretary Alex Acosta. That is not getting better with his supposed defense that he mounted today. In fact, that would seem like it's getting worse. Also, the materials that Acosta distributed today in his own defense additionally show that his office, Acosta's office, believed that Epstein was breaking the terms of the non-prosecution agreement they'd signed him up to. Quote, "It is clear that neither you nor your client ever intended to abide by the terms of the agreement that he signed." And they put that in writing. Acosta's office, Acosta's prosecutor saying, you were never intending to abide by that deal. Well, okay. I mean, once you've got an alleged perpetrator, right, who you've decided to give a non-prosecution agreement to for whatever reason, once that perpetrator violates the terms of that agreement, then deal's off, agreement's broken, you're no longer bound by it, prosecute away, right? But Alex Acosta's office never prosecuted Jeffrey Epstein. And Acosta, in his own defense, released this information today. I mean, purportedly as part of the reason that you're supposed to feel better about his actions here. It doesn't make things any better for him. And in fact, it would seem to make things worse. You not only gave Epstein this deal, your office believed that Epstein broke the deal, and you still didn't prosecute him? And the even bigger problem for Acosta is that what he strode to the podium to say today, his main argument for why he did this non-prosecution deal with Epstein back in the day, was that he was actually trying to be the real hero in the Epstein case. In the past, Acosta's always been able to be a little vague in his justifications for why he did this agreement to not prosecute Epstein. He's been able to be vague about it because he's never faced all that much pressure about it. He certainly didn't find the scandal to be any sort of barrier to the Trump administration picking him to be in the cabinet. But now Acosta is under pressure, and so now he is having to spell it out. And the main case that he made today is that he had to do this non-prosecution deal with Epstein because the state of Florida was screwing it up. Remember, he was the federal prosecutor there. He said state prosecutors had evidence on Epstein, but they weren't going to be able to get any kind of proper conviction or proper sentence. And so Acosta had to swoop in with this inexplicable deal. A federal non-prosecution agreement that would have Epstein pleading guilty to one state charge and doing time in a county jail where he got let out every day on work release, where his private driver picked him up and drove him home. Today, in response to Secretary Acosta's press conference, the top state prosecutor on the Epstein case responded with a written statement. Quote, "I can emphatically state that Mr. Acosta's recollection of this matter is completely wrong. My office, the state attorney's office, took the local police department's investigation of Epstein to a grand jury and subpoenaed witnesses. The grand jury returned a single-count indictment of felony solicitation of prostitution, a third-degree felony. Subsequently, so thereafter, the U.S. Attorney's Office, Alex Acosta's office, produced a 53-page indictment that was abandoned after secret negotiations between Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers and Mr. Acosta. The state attorney's office was not a party to those meetings or negotiations and definitely had no part in the federal non-prosecution agreement. No matter how my office, meaning how the state office resolved the state charges, the U.S. Attorney's Office, Alex Acosta's office, always had the ability to file its own federal charges. If Mr. Acosta was truly concerned with the state's case and felt that he had to rescue the matter, he would have moved forward with the 53-page federal indictment that his own office drafted. Instead, Alex Acosta brokered a secret plea deal that resulted in a non-prosecution agreement." He closes, "Mr. Acosta should not be allowed to rewrite history." So honestly, bottom line, this just turned out to be an unusually gross day in the news, even for the Trump era. If I had access to a shower in my office, I would have used it today just to get through the process of reading in on these developing stories. But as a legal matter and as a political matter in terms of the future of this cabinet official, it does seem to me like this cabinet official, Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, made the case against himself worse today. With this defense that he rolled out, which is immediately contested by the person who the defense pointed at, and also with the specific information that he handed out to the press today about the Jeffrey Epstein case and how it was handled under his leadership at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Florida. That said, I am not a lawyer. I'm just an easily grossed out middle-aged person who reads the news for a living. And so That is my sense, but we ought to check it out with somebody who knows these things. Joining us now is Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney, former senior FBI and Justice Department official. Chuck, it is great to see you. Thanks very much for making time to be here tonight.
Glad to be here, Rachel.
So I understand that you were able to see Acosta's press conference today and look at some of the materials that he handed out. Let me just ask you about the impression that I had as a non-lawyer looking at some of those materials, feeling like at least the public case, the non-legal case Acosta is making to justify his position, his actions in the Epstein case, seem worse. They don't seem to me to be helped by the material that he distributed.
He said a couple of things that made sense. I can start with that because it's much shorter, and a bunch of things that made no sense at all. The things that made sense, Rachel, these are hard cases and you want to be very sensitive to the victims. And that's where the logic in his press conference ended. Right? There's no, the state's attorney in Florida is 100% right. If Alex Acosta thought that the case was not being properly handled by the state, he had the complete ability to bring charges federally. They had the draft indictment. He did say that these cases are hard. Again, I will reiterate, they are hard. But he had more than 30 minor child victims in this case. Even if a bunch of them didn't want to testify, and I completely understand that, some number would. And oh, by the way, if some number would not, if they didn't feel they had the quantum of proof they needed, they simply could have continued the investigation until they did. There was no sort of time stamp on this. There was no urgency to negotiate a non-pros agreement. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense, Rachel.
Let me drill down on that last point that you're making there, because this is something that sort of dawned on me today that I had not previously appreciated with this case. I mean, Acosta has basically said that he didn't feel like he could bring charges for whatever reason. I mean, there's chapter and verse on this. He didn't feel like he could bring charges. That doesn't mean, though, that he had to bring an affirmative non-prosecution agreement. Regardless of what the state did, Acosta could have just let this investigation run. He affirmatively chose to enter into this non-prosecution agreement without any imperative to do so.
That's right. So first of all, just for context, we don't normally, in fact, we don't routinely or almost ever end cases with a non-prosecution agreement. If we don't have a case, we simply don't bring it. So there was no reason, there was no need to enter into a non-prosecution agreement. Putting that aside, there was absolutely no time limit on the investigation. The Southern District of New York, God bless them, just indicted the case, right? There's no statute of limitations problem. So if the if the federal prosecutors in Florida thought they didn't have enough, all they had to do was continue their work. It was that simple.
Chuck, one last question for you. Another thing that struck me today as, well, something that I wanted to ask you about because I didn't really understand the implication, was that Secretary Acosta said repeatedly words to the effect of, this was a different time, meaning I think he was implying that cases like this 12 years ago were handled in a very different way. We didn't have the same sensitivities. Maybe we didn't have the same legal tools. He seemed to be implying that this is a very different era for pursuing a trafficking case or the kind of case that SDNY is producing against Epstein right now compared to how it was back then.
Way, way, way back in 2007, in the dark ages of federal prosecution, I can assure you, Rachel, there were thousands of prosecutors and cops and agents around the country making difficult sex crimes cases. Look, we were trained in this way. We know how to work with victims. The notion that we couldn't bring such a case all the way back in 2007 is deeply wrong and deeply dangerous, and by the way, deeply insulting to the men and women who were doing this kind of work.
Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney, former senior FBI and Justice Department official, invaluable consult for us on nights like tonight. Chuck, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right, Senator Bernie Sanders is going to be here live with us in just a moment. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.